The rail is older than the nation it crosses. Rust has consumed its edges the way time consumes everything, not violently, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a slow, patient cellular dissolution that makes the original metal almost impossible to distinguish from the earth around it. Somewhere beneath the oxidized surface, there is still steel. There is still the memory of the foundry, of the hands that laid this track, of the singular human ambition that decided a train should go here, through this jungle, across this gorge, over this ocean, up this near vertical wall of stone. And then the train comes, not later, now. At this moment, as you watch, the train comes around the bend in the mountain, its horn barely audible over the wind, its carriage is full, far beyond full, and it crosses what should not be crossable, on rails that should not still be standing, through landscape that was never supposed to accommodate the weight of human civilization. It crosses anyway. This is the story of the world's most impossible railways, not the ones that appear in glossy travel magazines, photographed from meadows in the golden hour with tourists sipping coffee in panoramic windows. The others, the ones built by people who died building them, the ones that still carry thousands of people who have no other way home, the ones that cross the void on structures so ancient, so improbable, so quietly magnificent in their defiance of engineering reason that each crossing is less a journey than a negotiation between steel and gravity, between human necessity and the planet's indifference to it. The last trains to nowhere, running still. There is a bridge in Kanchanaburi. It spans the River Kwai on wooden trestles that have been replaced, rebuilt, patched, and reinforced so many times over the past 80 years that almost nothing of the original structure remains. And yet it is, unmistakably and in every way that matters, the same bridge, the same crossing, the same scar on the landscape that was cut by the same event, an event so costly in human life that the railway it produced was named, with the directness that only historical infamy permits, the Death Railway. In 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army needed a supply line connecting Bangkok to Rangoon, 415 kilometers through terrain that British engineers had previously surveyed and quietly concluded was unbuildable. The jungle was too dense, the mountains too steep, the rivers too wide, the timeline too short. The Japanese Army had a solution to the timeline problem. They had prisoners, more than 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, more than 200,000 conscripted Asian laborers, Burmese, Malay, Indonesian, Tamil, men whose names, in most historical accounts, do not appear at all. These were the hands that built the Death Railway, working in 16-hour shifts in monsoon rains that turned the jungle floor to deep mud, with tools that would have been inadequate for a road in peacetime, let alone a railway through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They cut through limestone, bridged rivers, and laid 415 kilometers of track in 16 months. The number most often cited, over 100,000 people died. That number requires a moment of stillness. 100,000 human beings, not soldiers killed in battle, workers, laborers, men who died of cholera, dysentery, and malaria, men who died of exhaustion in the precise literal sense, bodies that simply stopped, that had given everything and had nothing left to give. Men who died from beatings, men who died because the food allocation was calibrated not to sustain life but merely to extend it long enough to be useful. The railway was completed in October 1943. It was operational for less than 2 years before Allied bombing destroyed sections of the line. The Japanese Army abandoned it at the end of the war. Today, a portion of the Death Railway still operates. Tourists ride it through the Kwai Valley, photographing the bridge, buying refreshments from vendors who board at intermediate stations. The wooden trestles creak. The carriages sway above the river. The view is undeniably beautiful. Jungle, limestone, water the color of pale jade. And beneath every sleeper, beneath every meter of track, 100,000 people are still present, not as ghosts, as foundation. The railway exists because they died. Every journey along it is, whether the passenger knows it or not, made possible by their annihilation. Here is the question the history books rarely ask directly. What does it mean to still be running a railway built this way? Is the continued operation a form of memory, the track kept alive as testimony, or is it something more uncomfortable, the infrastructure of atrocity quietly absorbed into the ordinary, the horror normalized by the simple persistence of timetables? The river does not answer. It moves beneath the bridge as it has always moved, indifferent to the weight of what crosses above it. The mountain did not want to be crossed. The Andes at this latitude, the province of Chimborazo in central Ecuador, rise with a particular hostility, their faces not merely steep but genuinely vertical. Limestone walls hundreds of meters high that offer no passage, no compromise, no invitation for the human ambition that was, in the early 20th century, determined to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The engineers knew it was impossible before they began. The surveys were unambiguous. There was one section, a cliff face that dropped 500 meters in less than a kilometer, that couldn't be negotiated by any conventional railway engineering. The gradient was too severe. No locomotive built could pull a train up a slope at that angle. No track could safely carry the weight. They built it anyway. The solution they arrived at was not elegant. Elegance was not available here. What they found instead was something that exists in a category between engineering and improvisation: the switchback. The track ascends the cliff face not in a straight line, which would be impossible, but in a zigzag. The train moves forward up one section of track, stops, then reverses onto a higher section, then moves forward again, ascending in a series of alternating directions like a snake climbing a wall. It works, barely, on a good day. The construction killed thousands of workers. The precise number is unknown because the records were not kept with care. Yellow fever and malaria moved through the labor camps with the efficiency of things that have evolved specifically for this purpose. The cliff sections were so dangerous that workers were lowered on ropes to drill the rock for the track bed. Some of the ropes broke. The line opened in 1908 and was immediately recognized as one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in South America, and also one of the most dangerous operational railways on the planet. In its early decades, passengers rode on the roof, not out of adventurousness but out of necessity. The carriages were invariably overcrowded, the roof was available, and the alternative was not traveling at all. Photographs from this era show the train ascending the Devil's Nose with dozens of passengers spread across the carriage roofs, gripping whatever they can find, the gorge falling away beside them to depths that the photographs, taken from a safe distance, make look abstract, but which, in the lived experience of the passenger, were anything but. Today, the service is more regulated, but the mountain is unchanged, the cliff is unchanged. The switchback logic, forward, stop, reverse, forward, stop, reverse, remains the only way through. When the train reverses on the Devil's Nose, facing briefly into empty space before the track engages and it begins to climb the next section, there is a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, where the passengers looking out the rear window see nothing but sky and the canyon floor far below, and understand in a way that no description can fully convey exactly what it means to be on this railway. What the builders of the Devil's Nose understood, and what their successors understand still, is that some obstacles cannot be circumvented. They can only be negotiated, slowly, painfully, at great cost, in a zigzag pattern that looks, from a sufficient distance, like confusion, but is, from the inside, the only possible form of progress. The official capacity is 600. Read that again. Then look at the image in your mind, the image you have perhaps seen, or perhaps constructed from the description, of a train in the Congolese interior, every surface covered with human beings, on the roof, on the steps, in the spaces between carriages, on the roof of the locomotive itself. 1,400 people beyond the design limit of the vessel they are trusting with their lives. This is not an emergency. This is not a breakdown in normal service. This is the normal service. The railway in Katanga province was built by Belgian colonial administrators in the early 20th century, primarily to extract minerals from one of the most mineral-rich regions in the world. The copper, the cobalt that is in the battery in the device you are using to watch this, was moved on this railway. The railway was built for the minerals. The people were an afterthought. After independence, the railway infrastructure received the investment that a population of millions requires, and a government without resources could not provide, which is to say, almost nothing. The tracks aged, the rolling stock aged. The maintenance regime that kept the system operational became increasingly heroic, increasingly improvised, increasingly dependent on the knowledge and ingenuity of individual mechanics working with parts that were no longer manufactured in workshops that lacked the tools the work required. The train still ran. It ran at 10 kilometers per hour. Not as a concession to safety, though the speed did have that effect, but because the track, in its current state, could not safely support higher speeds. Sections of rail that were laid a century ago, that have been through floods and droughts and the vibrations of a million heavy crossings, that have been repaired with whatever material was available when they cracked. These sections have their own opinions about velocity, 10 kilometers per hour, for days. The journey between the major cities of Katanga, a journey that would take hours by air, a day by good road, takes by this train the better part of a week. People bring food, they bring cooking equipment, they construct in the spaces between the bodies that cover every surface the temporary infrastructure of a life in transit, small stoves, sleeping arrangements, social hierarchies based on who arrived first and secured the better position on the roof. There is no toilet facility equal to the number of passengers. There has never been. The management of human waste at this scale, in this context, is handled through a system that everyone on the train understands and no official document acknowledges. Why? Because the road is worse. The road through this region, the alternative, the surface upon which vehicles might theoretically travel, has been destroyed by the same heavy mining trucks that carry the minerals the railway once carried. Deep ruts, sections that vanish in the rainy season beneath mud so deep that trucks have been lost in it, not metaphorically but physically, the vehicles sinking into the earth and staying there. The road is, for significant portions of the year, slower than the train, and so 2,000 people board. And the train moves at 10 kilometers per hour into the interior, and on the roof a child watches the forest pass and does not know, and perhaps should not know, that the cobalt in the battery of the device that might one day be handed to her as a birthday gift was moved on a train very much like this one, by people whose names were not recorded, whose lives were not counted. We use the word infrastructure as though it were neutral, a technical term, a descriptor of physical systems. But every infrastructure was built by someone, was maintained by someone, is used by someone. The railway in Katanga is not neutral. It is the physical record of a century of decisions about whose movement matters, whose comfort is worth engineering for, whose time is worth saving. Those decisions have been made. The train runs on their consequences. The men who built the White Pass Railway were chasing something that does not exist. Gold rushes are, in their essence, exercises in collective delusion, the mass transmission of a belief that wealth is available over there in sufficient quantities to justify any cost. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 was the largest such event in North American history, drawing more than 100,000 people to the Yukon in 2 years. Most of them arrived with no experience of the terrain, no preparation for the climate, and no plan beyond the conviction that the gold was real and that they would find it. The White Pass was one of 2 routes into the Yukon. The other, the Chilkoot Pass, was steeper and shorter. The White Pass was merely lethal. Its trail in the winter of 1897 to 98 became known among the men who walked it as the Dead Horse Trail, not metaphorically, but because it was littered for its entire length with the carcasses of horses that had been worked to death on its slopes. The men who survived the Dead Horse Trail built and died building its replacement. The White Pass and Yukon Route Railway was constructed between 1898 and 1900, ascending 873 meters in just 32 kilometers through terrain that seemed designed specifically to defeat the project. Gorges so sheer that workers had to be lowered on ropes to drill holes in the rock for the blasting charges. Permafrost that refused to accept the weight of the track bed. Weather that killed men not occasionally but regularly, in avalanches, in falls, in the mundane brutality of wet clothing in sub-zero temperatures. When it was finished, the White Pass Railway was immediately recognized as an engineering landmark. It remains one. The narrow gauge track hugs cliff faces with a proximity that makes passengers instinctively lean away from the window. The bridges cross gorges at heights that the engineers of the time calculated and the passengers of the time and now experience as a physical fact in the body, a tightening in the chest that no amount of rational understanding of structural engineering can fully suppress. The gold rush ended. The railway remained. It has carried, over its century of operation, not only gold and gold seekers, but everything that the communities of the Yukon required to survive: food, fuel, medicine, materials. In the winters when the roads were impassable, which were most winters, the railway was the only connection between the coast and the interior. For the people who depended on it, the White Pass was not a heritage attraction. It was, in the most literal sense, a lifeline. Today, the railway operates as a tourist service in summer and a freight carrier when conditions require. The equipment has been updated, the safety standards have been modernized, but the track, the original track, the track that was built by men who died building it, over cliff faces that have not moved and gorges that have not filled, is the same. Every time the train crosses the bridge at Dead Horse Gulch, it crosses on foundations that were built in 1898 by men whose names are mostly lost, in conditions that were deliberately and systematically made as brutal as the economics of the time permitted, in pursuit of a dream that the vast majority of them never realized. The train does not remember this. The bridge does not remember this. The gorge, if it remembers anything at all, keeps its own counsel. The railway built of gold runs still. What it carries now is not gold. It is the far stranger cargo of the present visiting the past, of living bodies moving over structures that exist because other bodies gave out. This is what heritage is, when you examine it without the soft focus of nostalgia, the durable remainder of someone else's expenditure. The ocean does not care about timetables. It never has. The Indian Ocean, in the channel between mainland India and the island of Ramaswaram, moves according to its own schedule, a schedule written in lunar cycles, in seasonal pressure systems, in the memory of 10,000 cyclones, and it has, over the course of a century, expressed its complete indifference to the presence of a railway bridge in its midst, with a consistency that the railway's operators have learned to respect. The Pamban Bridge opened in 1914. For nearly 5 decades, it was the longest sea bridge in India, a 2-kilometer span of steel girders crossing the Palk Strait on stone piers that stand in open water. Trains cross it at walking pace, and they are correct to do so. The strait is one of the most cyclone-prone sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. In 1964, a cyclonic storm struck the bridge while a passenger train was crossing it. The storm surge, a wall of water generated by the cyclone's pressure differential, struck the bridge and the train simultaneously. The carriages were thrown into the sea. More than 100 people died. The bridge was repaired. The railway continued. This is the logic of the necessary. The bridge is the only way to reach Rameswaram, and Rameswaram is one of the holiest sites in Hinduism, and hundreds of thousands of pilgrims travel there each year, and they must cross the bridge, and so the bridge must remain open, and the trains must cross it, and the ocean must be negotiated rather than avoided. The bridge has a particular feature that makes it unlike almost any other railway bridge on Earth: a section in the middle that opens, a bascule span that lifts to allow ships through, and then closes again, and the train crosses over the closed span and continues to the island. When the bascule span opens, there is a gap in the bridge. The train stops on both sides of the gap and waits. The ships pass, the span closes, the train crosses. But the ocean is the same ocean. The cyclones are the same cyclones. The pilgrims are the same pilgrims, traveling to the same holy island for the same ancient reasons, crossing the same water that was always there before the bridge and will be there long after the bridge, in whatever form it takes, is gone. There is something particular about a railway that crosses open water. On land, if something goes wrong, there is ground. There is the possibility, however slim, of stopping, of getting out, of finding another way. On a bridge over the open sea in the middle of a crossing, there is no alternative to continuing. The train must go forward, or it must go nowhere. The ocean, in this way, teaches the same lesson it has always taught. There are situations from which the only exit is through. At 4,220 meters above sea level, the sky begins. Not metaphorically, physiologically. At this altitude, the oxygen content of the air is approximately 60% of what it is at sea level. The body, confronted with this deficit, does what it does with any deficit. It compensates imperfectly with symptoms that range from headache and nausea to confusion, and in severe cases, the kind of judgment impairment that makes high-altitude environments so specifically dangerous. The train to the clouds, the Tren a las Nubes, begins in Salta, in the northwestern corner of Argentina, at an altitude of approximately 1,187 meters. It ends at its highest point, at the La Polvoria Viaduct, at 4,220 meters. The journey covers 217 kilometers and takes approximately 15 hours. For most of that journey, the train is climbing. The engineering that makes this possible is, in the truest sense of that word, incredible. Not merely impressive, but difficult to believe when you are standing in front of it. The track cannot simply ascend a straight slope. The gradient required to gain that much altitude in that distance would be beyond any locomotive's traction capability. So the designers used a combination of switchbacks and spirals, the track doubling back on itself, climbing its own flanks, looping around the mountain shoulders in curves so tight the locomotive can see its own tail. The La Polvoria Viaduct at the summit is the revelation. A steel structure 63 meters high and 224 meters long, spanning a canyon in the high Puna Desert at an altitude where, if you stand up too quickly, the world goes briefly gray at the edges. The train crosses it at a speed that allows the passengers to look straight down at the canyon floor and understand, with a clarity that lower altitudes do not provide, exactly how far up they have come. At this altitude, the clouds are below you, not as a poetic conceit, actually below you. The white cumulus of the Andean afternoon, which at sea level would require an aircraft to see from above, are here visible from the train window, drifting through the canyon below the viaduct. The train is above the clouds. The passengers who boarded at sea level this morning are now looking down at weather. Many of them feel terrible. Altitude sickness does not respect the magnificence of the view. It arrives with its own agenda, the headache first, then the nausea, then a heaviness behind the eyes that the Spanish word for altitude sickness, soroche, captures better than the English equivalent. The railway carries supplemental oxygen for passengers who require it. Some do. And yet they come, in the tens of thousands, each year. Because the train to the clouds offers something that is genuinely unavailable elsewhere. The experience of crossing the Andes by train, of feeling the altitude not from the cabin of a pressurized aircraft but from the inside, in the body, in the way the lungs work harder and the head pulses faintly, and the world at 4,220 meters is a different world, colder and thinner and more ancient feeling than the one you left at breakfast. The train has been running since 1948. It has crossed the La Polvorilla Viaduct hundreds of thousands of times. The steel of the viaduct, tested each crossing by the weight of the train and the cold of the Andean night, has held. Here at the highest point of the journey, with clouds below and nothing above but the Andean sky, the train is doing something that no road can do and no aircraft bothers to. It is letting the passenger feel, in real time, in their own body, exactly how far they have traveled from the ordinary world. This is what the last trains to nowhere are, at their best, not transportation. Evidence. Steel rusts but does not disappear. A railway, abandoned, does not vanish. It changes state. The wooden sleepers return to the earth from which they came, slowly through rot and compression over decades. The ballast stone sinks and scatters. But the steel of the rail, oxidized to the color of autumn leaves, persists. Long after the last train has passed, long after the timetable has been discontinued, and the station building has been taken back by whatever vegetation was waiting at the perimeter, the rail remains. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the forests of sub-Saharan Africa, in the deserts of South America and the tundra of the far north, there are rails that have not carried a train in 50, 60, 70 years. They mark the landscape like sutures, the closed wounds of a century's ambitions, the physical residue of the decisions that were made in boardrooms and colonial offices and engineering firms about where the train should go and why. Each of these abandoned rails is a question. Why here? What was expected from this route? Whose movement did it serve and whose movement did it ignore? What did it cost to build, and who paid that cost, and in what currency, in wages, in years of life, in deaths? The Death Railway is still running. The White Pass is still running. The train to the clouds is still running. The 2,000-passenger train of Katanga is still running. The Devil's Nose zigzags up its impossible cliff every day, its passengers briefly facing the void before the track engages and the ascent continues. They are all, in their way, last trains, running to destinations that the world's infrastructure has otherwise decided do not merit connection, crossing landscapes that are too remote, too hostile, too economically marginal for the investment that a modern, safe, efficient transportation link would require. And the people who board them, the pilgrim crossing the Pamban Bridge to Ramaswaram, the trader on the Katanga roof who has calculated precisely and correctly that this is the fastest available option, the tourist on the White Pass who is trying to touch, for a few hours, the texture of a history they can feel in the creaking of the bridge but not quite reach, the mountaineer boarding the train to the clouds, whose body is about to remind them insistently and without mercy that altitude is not a metaphor, all of them moving, all of them trusting, the rail, the bridge, the viaduct, the trestle, with the particular trust that travel requires, the suspension of the knowledge that things fail, that steel fatigues, that the storm comes without announcement, that the calculation the engineer made in 1898 or 1908 or 1948 was made with the information available then, and some of that information has since been revised. The train moves anyway. This is perhaps the deepest truth about the last trains to nowhere. They run not because the infrastructure is adequate, or because the route is safe, or because the economics make sense, but because the people who need them have decided that they will trust the track. That trust is not naive. It is not ignorance of the risk. It is the decision, made in full knowledge of the gap between what the bridge was designed for and what it is being asked to do, to cross anyway, because the alternative is to stay. And staying for most of the people on these trains is not an option. The rail rusts, the train comes, the passengers board. Somewhere in a canyon in Ecuador, the Devil's Nose is climbing. The train reverses, the passengers look into the void, the track engages, the ascent continues. It has always continued. The last trains to nowhere are not going nowhere. They are going to the only place the people who board them have to go. And the distance between those two descriptions is the full width of the world.